Damien Bendall committed his horrendous acts under the influence of drugs. He murdered, first of all, his girlfriend who was pregnant with his child. Then he murdered her 2 young children. And then he murdered the school friend of one of the children who was staying over. This all took place in the Derbyshire town of Kilmarsh in September 2021. He also confessed to the rape of one of the children, a little girl. Bendall got his whole life order in 2022. Now viewer, if I've got you hooked on the video so far, do subscribe, give the video a like, drop a comment when you're ready and donate. Hit the thanks button below, I'll appreciate you. On the 20th of June 2020, in Forbury Gardens, a public park located in Reading, Berkshire, Khairi Saadallah stabbed to death James Furlong, 36, David Wales, 49, and Joe Ritchie Bennett, 39. It was a terrorist atrocity. The judge of the trial, Mr. Justice Sweeney, said, quote, "During the course of the attack and afterwards, and because he was seeking to advance a political, religious or ideological cause, the defendant was shouting in Arabic, 'God is the greatest and God accept my jihad,' unquote." Saadallah picked up his whole life order in 2021. Stephen Port, who was born in 1975, is not only a serial killer but also a serial rapist. Between 2014 and 2015, Port murdered 4 young men that he met online. He'd get them to come over to his flat over in Barking in East London, and there he would drug them with GHB, gamma hydroxybutyric acid, quite a well-known date rape drug, and then of course rape them. And all 4 victims died from an overdose of the drug. In the case of one victim, Paul inserted the drug, or rather injected it, directly into the man's you-know-what hole.
So did you have any involvement in the death of the male that we just spoke about a short while ago, Gabriel Klein?
No, I did not.
So, were you involved in administering any drugs or poisons or noxious substances to him?
No, I don't administer drugs to anyone or give drugs to anyone. That's done at the party boy.
Might help if I show you a picture. I'll call this CRT. So this is Jack Taylor. Do you recognise that, mate?
No. No, I just don't recognise him. I don't pay full attention to the guys' faces when I have paid attention to the parties. But I don't recognise his face.
So you don't recognise his face?
I do not know. No.
And I mean that's Jack Taylor. So you don't recognise?
No, I don't.
Jack Taylor?
No.
Port got his whole life order in 2016. To this day, though, apparently he denies any of the murders. Brian Whitelock, who comes from Swansea in Wales, is another triple murderer. His first 2 victims were Nicky Morgan and Glenn Whitelock. Glenn was his own brother. He killed them in the course of a drink and drugs party over at the home of Nicky Morgan. When he got out, he then was befriended by a lady called Wendy Buckney. She was a 71-year-old lady. She loved her horses. She knew about Brian Whitelock's past, but she believed that everyone deserved a second chance. One day, under the influence of drink and drugs again, just like in the case of his first 2 murders, he went over to Wendy Buckney's home, battered her, did something sexual against her, and then after he finished battering her to death with all kinds of things, including some shelving, he loaded a pile of furniture and things over her body and walked away. He got his whole life prison order in 2024. For murdering 7 newborn babies and attempting to murder a further 8, Former neonatal nurse Lucy Letby is doing a record 15 whole life prison sentences. Everyone always talks about how normal Lucy Letby seemed to everyone. She had a good circle of friends, a great social life, went on holidays with her colleagues at work. People liked her well enough. She had a bit of a fling with a married doctor. She worked at the Countess of Chester Hospital and she murdered babies and attempted to murder them by injecting insulin and air into their bloodstream. Lucy Letby's murder trial lasted nearly a year. It finished in summer 2023 and Letby got 14 whole life orders. The following year, she got her 15th whole life order following a retrial of one of the murder charges, or it was either a murder charge or a charge of attempted murder. Either way, she was convicted. There are lots of people who say that Lucy Letby is a scapegoat. The deaths of those newborn babies, who I think were all premature, were due to clinical errors of other people. She keeps appealing. Her story, I think, will continue to unravel for many years to come. Between 2009 and 2010, Stephen Griffiths, who comes from Bradford in Yorkshire, murdered 3 women: 43-year-old Susan Rushworth, 31-year-old Shirley Armitage, and 36-year-old Suzanne Blamyers. All 3 women happened to be sex workers. Griffiths killed his victims with a crossbow and also claimed to have cannibalised any one or more of them, although that latter claim has never been proven. He got his whole life order in 2010, and while in prison he has attempted suicide on several occasions, but staff have always caught him in time. And in 2011 he went on a 120-day hunger strike, during which time he avoided contact with other people. But there is such a crazy irony to this guy's story. In 2009, he went to the University of Bradford to write a PhD in homicide studies. In October 2020, over a period of 7 days, Anthony Russell murdered 3 people. On the 23rd of October 2020, a lady called Julie Williams, 58, phoned West Midlands Police to report that her son, David Williams, 31, hadn't been seen since the 21st of October. On the 25th of October, West Midlands Police were called by Miss Williams' sister to report that Miss Williams herself, Julie Williams, was now also missing. Police officers forced their way into Miss Williams' house and found her dead on the living room floor. Russell, of course, knew that the police were onto him and went on the run. Before he claimed his final victim, he attacked 2 other people who happened to be elderly people. He then tricked 31-year-old Nicole McGregor, who at the time was 18 weeks pregnant, into meeting him in a secluded spot on the promise of drugs, and that's where he murdered her. Russell got his whole life order in March 2022. Dale Cregan's murder of 2 women police officers in 2012 was as vile and shocking as it was gratuitous. Fiona Bone, 32, and Nicola Hughes, 23, were out on a routine patrol on the 18th of September 2012 when they were sent to Abbey Gardens in Hattersley, Tameside in Greater Manchester. This was at about 11 a.m. and it was in response to a report of criminal damage. Someone had phoned up and said that some random person had thrown a pavement slab through their window. The person who made that call was well-known gangster Dale Cregan, only the person taking the call didn't know that at the time. When Miss Bone and Miss Hughes turned up to Cregan's home, he opened fire on them, he shot at them, he threw a grenade at them. Fiona Bone died at the scene while Nicola Hughes was badly wounded and died later in hospital. And Dale Cregan's reason for doing that was that he was fed up with the police constantly constantly questioning him and members of his family, going around to their home, all in investigation of a murder. I think it was about 2 murders actually that Cregan had recently carried out. That was literally Cregan's reason for taking the lives of these 2 women. In addition, having also been convicted of the 2 murders for which he was being investigated at the time when he murdered the 2 police women, Dale Cregan is officially a quadruple murderer. Cregan got his whole life order in June 2013. Levi Bellfield is literally evil by name. Born in 1968, he's a serial killer, a sex offender, a rapist, a kidnapper and a burglar. He's also a woman beater. He had numerous relationships which spawned him, I think, 10 or 11 children, and many of those relationships collapsed because he used to beat the you-know-what out of his girlfriend and wives. He was married to some of them and just living with others just as a boyfriend and girlfriend set up. In 2008, he was convicted of the murders of Marsha McDonnell and Emily de la Grange and of the attempted murder of Kate Sheedy, and he got a whole life order. And then in 2011, he was found guilty of the murder of schoolgirl Millie Dowler, and he again received a whole life order for that murder as well. So he's got 2 whole life orders, and he was in fact the first prisoner in the UK to receive 2 whole life orders.
Did you get a kick out of being involved in these sort of inquiries?
No comment.
Do you think it's a macho type of thing to hear?
No.
Do you think it will help your notoriety?
No comment.
Do you honestly believe that your actions over the 21st and the 22nd of March 2002 are the actions of an innocent man?
No comment.
Then are you an innocent man?
No comment.
Because if you are, tell us.
No comment.
And give us that explanation for where you were and what you were doing.
No comment.
Are you able to do that, Levi?
No comment.
Sarah's told you what she believes you did that particular day, and I wholly support what she says. I believe you took her off the street that day. I believe your motivation was sexual, and I believe you took her back to Collingwood Place, and I believe you killed her there. That's the truth, isn't it?
No comment, sir.
That's what happened.
No comment.
And then you've used the day of next year to move her body. Is that the truth?
No.
Because that's what's happened, isn't it?
No comment.
And then sometime over the following few days, you've driven down to Hampshire, an area that you know, and you've dumped her body.
No comment, sir.
That's the truth, isn't it?
No comment, sir.
He once, as a child, had SHX with a rabbit, and afterwards he broke the rabbit's neck. His original surname was none other than Rabbit. Rabbetts. He used to sleep with his mother. I don't think they did the thing together, but they used to sleep in the same bed for many, many years. I think well into Levi's teens. And whenever he used to go home and see his mother as an adult, again, he used to sleep in the same bed as her. She wiped his body bot for him until he was around 12. And he also, before he took to murder, was alleged to have committed a number of essays against young girls when he worked as a nightclub bouncer. But even though the man is as thick as you know what, somehow he was always able to destroy the DNA evidence that he left behind, and so he was never caught. And the police in many cases didn't take the allegations from the girls who came forward about him seriously. A lot of them took drugs and stuff like that, and the police really just didn't care. And so that is the story of Levi Bellfield. Rose West was born in 1953 in North Devon. Between 1973 and 1987, alongside her husband, she tortured, raped and murdered all of 10 young women. On her own, in 1971, she murdered the stepdaughter of Fred West. By that point, she and Fred had got married and Fred was in prison. She told him what she'd done and he didn't care. They used to get these young women to come into their home. They lived in this really big home in Cromwell Street in Gloucester in southwest England, and then they would lead them down to a cellar that Fred had purpose built for the mission of torturing and murdering these young women, and that is what the two of them did. They would both essay and grape them over a number of days. They would hang them upside down before eventually killing them. They had several children, 7 in total, and in fact of the 7 children, 3 were fathered by punters that Rose had in her work as a prostitute. That's something she started doing after she had her second child, and she really loved it. She used to advertise, she used to go out and into the West Indian community and get black guys to come and shag her for money. Rose and Fred were in the habit of essaying their own children. In 1987, one of their children, who was 16 at the time, Heather West, was standing up to Fred saying, "No, leave me alone, I don't want you to do the thing to me." So they dragged her down to the cellar and murdered her, and it was on Rose's instigation. Fred West killed himself in prison. Rose, meanwhile, has been banged up since 1995 under a whole life order. As at the time of this recording, Rose West is on her last legs. She's getting end of life care, so she'll soon be no more. And that's the story of Rose West. Arthur Simpson-Kent murdered his partner, who was a former Eastenders actress called Cyan Blake, and she was 43, and he also killed their two sons, Zachary, aged 8, and Amon, aged 4. He did so by beating and stabbing all three of them at their home in Erith in London in December 2015. Police believe that Simpson-Kent committed the murders because Cyan was planning to leave him. He buried the bodies of the three victims in the garden and then ran away to Ghana, but he was later caught and brought back to the UK. He got his whole life order in October 2016. The three men that Joanna Dennehy murdered in March 2013 were none other than her friends, her sexual partners to be exact. When she was little, Joanna Dennehy was a very kind, caring, sensitive girl, very close to her sister. She was a very academically gifted pupil who had aspirations of becoming a lawyer, until one day in her teens, for reasons that people just can't explain, she changed. She got into drugs, she got into drink, she got into sex. She ran off with a bloke who was a lot older than her that she came onto, had a couple of babies with him. Then that relationship broke down. She went to prison, came out, got in with some really, really dodgy characters, and then in March 2013 killed 3 people and tried to kill another 2. She said that the reason she did it is because she wanted to see if she was as evil and as cold-hearted as she thought she was, and that after she killed the first person, she had to keep going. It was moreish and she couldn't get enough. She was convicted in 2014 along with the 3 men, her so-called undertakers that had helped her, in particular by getting rid of the bodies. And in fact, Joanna Dennehy's killings were known as the Peterborough ditch murders because they dumped the bodies in a ditch out in Peterborough in Cambridgeshire. The 3 accomplices were given finite terms, and I think at least one of them has since been released. Dennehy herself got her whole life order in 2014. For 70s career criminal John Childs, killing people for pay was a great little earner. He murdered 6 people. He was paid to do so, and he did those murders between 1974 and 1978. Childs murdered Terence Eve in 1974, Robert Brown in 1975, George Brett and his 10-year-old son Terry Brett later on in 1975, Fred Sherwood in 1978, and Ronald Andrews later on in 1978. The man was jailed in December 1979, with the murders being committed by shooting and stabbing. John William Cooper, who was born in 1944, is also known as the Bullseye Killer, and he's a Welsh serial killer. On the 26th of May 2011, he was given a whole life order for the 1985 double murder of siblings Richard and Helen Thomas, and for the 1989 double murder of Peter and Gwenda Dixon. The murders were known in the media as the Pembrokeshire murders or the coastal murders, because that's where the murders took place, and because of those murders, tourism in that area dropped dramatically. Cooper was also sentenced for the rape of a 16-year-old girl and a sexual assault on a 15-year-old girl, both of those attacks having been carried out while a group of 5 teenagers were held at gunpoint in March 1996 in a wooded area behind the Mount Estate in Cooper's hometown of Milford Haven in Pembrokeshire. Now we've got the joint case of Kenneth Regan and William Horncy. In 2003 in London, 5 members of an Indian family were kidnapped and murdered by a criminal gang. The millionaire businessman Amarjit Chauhan disappeared along with his wife, his 2 baby sons and his mother-in-law. The bodies were initially buried in Devon before they were later dumped in the sea off Poole in Dorset, where 3 of them were eventually discovered in the English Channel. The bodies of the 2 little boys were never found. Kenneth Regan and William Horncy were given whole life orders for the 5 murders. Peter Rees was convicted of one of the murders. The motive was financial, as they planned to take over Amarjit Chauhan's freight company, which they then wanted to use as a front for importing drugs. the case was highly publicised due to the sheer brutality of the crime, and the trial was the longest in the history of the Metropolitan Police. Mark Richard Hobson, who was born on the 2nd of September 1969, killed 4 people in North Yorkshire in July 2004. His first murder was that of his very girlfriend, Claire Sanderson, and he killed her at their home, which was near Selby. After that, he lured Claire's twin sister, Diane, to the home and then murdered her several days later. Afterwards, he fled the property and murdered an elderly couple who lived several miles away before going on the run. He was arrested soon after, 8 days after I think, when he was spotted hiding in bushes near a petrol station in North Yorkshire. A bin man who had a history of violence, drug addiction and alcoholism, Hobson pleaded guilty to all the charges against him in April 2005 and got his whole life prison sentence. His subsequent appeal for a lower tariff failed. When Rashan Arshad murdered his wife and their 3 children in a so-called honour killing, he felt, quote, totally justified in what he did, unquote. That quotation comes from the police who were involved in the case. A 36-year-old taxi driver, Arshad beat his wife and 3 children to death with a rounder's bat at their home in Cheadle-Hulme, Manchester in July 2006. This then is how Uzma Rayhan, 32, Adam, 11, Abbas, 8 and Henna, 6 all lost their lives. According to investigating officers, Arshad felt his wife had brought the killing on herself by having an affair. This adulterous behaviour of Uzma's shamed the whole family, meaning that they all had to die, except the husband. He got his whole life order in 2007. In the early hours of the 7th of August 1985, near the village of Tolly's-Hunt Darcy in Essex, southeast England, Neville and Jean Bamber, both 61, their adopted daughter Sheila Caffell, 28, and Sheila's 6-year-old twin sons Daniel and Nicholas Caffell were all shot dead in their home, White House Farm. The only member of the immediate family to survive the night was the adopted son, Jeremy Bamber, who was then aged 24 and who, luckily for him, had been at his own home in the nearby village of Goldfinger when the mass murder took place. The police were first alerted to a disturbance at White House Farm when, at 3 a.m. on the 7th of August, Jeremy himself called them, claiming to have just received a distressing call from his father, telling him that his sister had gone berserk and that she had a gun.
My father's phoned from White House Farm and he sounded really frightened. He says, my sister's gone crazy and she's got a gun.
Jeremy added that after he himself heard a shot being fired, the line had gone dead. In his call to the police, Jeremy referred to his sister as a nutter. This was a reference to the lady's recent diagnosis of schizophrenia. Initially, the police wrote this devastating set of murders up as murder-suicide. When they went to investigate, you see, they found the body of Sheila Caffell with blood oozing from her throat and with the semi-automatic rifle belonging to Neville, with which all the murders had been perpetrated, lying so as to be pointing towards Sheila's throat. One of Jeremy's cousins, however, whose name is Anne Eaton, discovered 3 days after the killings that the silencer to the murder weapon was in a cupboard in the home instead of being on the rifle, which is where it had always been kept. It seemed very unlikely to Anne and to other members of the family that Sheila would have murdered everyone with the silencer on the rifle and then thoughtfully gone and put the silencer away before shooting herself. They also estimated that keeping the silencer on the rifle would have made the rifle too long for Sheila to reach the trigger in order to shoot herself in the face. It also emerged that Sheila had not 1 bullet wound to the face, but 2, which, as you can see, makes it even less likely that she shot herself. It's also hard to believe, I'd say, that Instead of calling the police or trying to save either his family or himself when his daughter started shooting everyone, Neville Bamber chose to call his son instead. How could he have done any such thing with bullet after bullet flying around his head, for instance? Jeremy Bamber murdered his entire immediate family for the substantial inheritance that he stood to gain after doing so. Straight after the funerals, which took place a few days after the killings, the young man not only went on a windsurfing holiday with his girlfriend, Julie Mugford, but also did lots and lots of partying besides that. That doesn't sound like grief or sadness to me. It was Julie's very report to the police some weeks later, when she and Jeremy had split up, of Jeremy's year-long plan to do away with his whole family and frame his sister, that triggered a renewed police probe into the massacre, which led, in October 1986, to Jeremy's conviction for the killings and to the whole life prison sentence for the perpetrator that came with that. The case of Mark Martin from 2005 feels to me like something of a premonition of the atrocities of Valdo Calocane, and you should look that guy up if you're not familiar with his horrendous acts. In 2005, Mark Martin killed 3 homeless women in Nottingham, and he killed them between December 2004 and January 2005. He said that his motive for the murders was to become, quote, Nottingham's first serial killer, unquote. He had 2 accomplices and they were also convicted, but whereas Martin got a whole life prison order, his accomplices received prison terms of 14 and 25 years respectively. Of the 4 murders that Robert Maudsley, who was born in June 1953 in Liverpool, committed between 1974 and 1978, 3 were committed while he was in criminal custody. One of no fewer than 12 children, Maudsley found himself, at the age of 8, being returned to the care of his parents after having been taken away from them, along with some of his siblings, at the age of 21 months due to serious parental neglect. He was returned to the care of social services at 16, however, after suffering years of the most horrific violence and essay from his lorry driver father, who was often put up to his abusive behaviour towards his son by none other than his wife, Maudsley's own mother. Having developed severe psychological trauma, as attested by his numerous attempts at suicide, and having become a substance abuser, at 20, Maudsley was supporting himself down in London by working as a prostitute. He garroted a client of his, John Farrell, over in Wood Green, North London, in March 1974, after the man showed him pictures of his child SA victims. After handing himself into the police, Maudsley was sent to Broadmoor Hospital, a psychiatric unit, having been deemed unfit to stand trial. Nothing much came of the man's act from 1976 of holding a fellow patient hostage. That wasn't the case, however, when he murdered another fellow patient by the name of David Francis, who happened to be a child SE ex-offender. Having carried out Francis's torture and murder alongside David Cheeseman, another patient, Maudsley claimed that his reason for ramming a sharpened spoon into his deceased victim's ear with such force that it penetrated through to the man's brain and then splitting the man's head open, exposing his very brain, was to enable him to literally feed on the man's brain. Even though the perpetrator was proven ultimately not to have cannibalised his victim in any way, the media dubbing of Hannibal the Cannibal that this claim of his earned him has stuck with him even up to now. Maudsley was tried for and convicted of Francis's murder, sent to Wakefield's maximum security prison in West Yorkshire, planned on the 29th of July 1978 to murder 7 of his fellow inmates, succeeded in murdering 2, got a whole life prison order, got moved into an underground cage built specifically for him, and in 2000 had his request for a pet budgie denied. When, in April 2025, the man was moved to HMP Whitemoor in Cambridgeshire, he had spent all of 42 years in solitary confinement. with, moreover, the 51 years that he served, as at the time of this recording. He's the UK's longest serving prisoner and apparently has no desire to be released. Well, when you're bound by your sentence to be locked up until you die, that's quite handy, I'd say. Peter Moore was born in 1946 and he used to manage cinemas in North Wales. That was when he wasn't committing any of the 4 murders for which he is now rotting in prison under a whole life prison order. Before he took to murder, the man committed no fewer than 39 sex attacks on men in North Wales and in Merseyside over a 20-year period. He committed his 4 murders between September and December 1995. He stabbed his victims and then mutilated them. At trial, he told the jury that the crimes were committed by a fictitious homosexual lover that he nicknamed Jason after the killer in the Friday the 13th horror films. The jury, of course, found him guilty on all 4 counts of murder. In March 2011, Moore challenged his whole life prison sentence in the European Court of Human Rights, and he aimed, in fact, to have the whole life order outlawed throughout Europe. However, he failed. Lawrence Bierton, who was born in 1959, is a triple murderer. On the 25th of June 1995, 79-year-old Aileen Duddell and her 72-year-old sister Elsie Gregory discovered their gardeners, Lawrence Bierton and Michael Pluck, stealing from them. Bierton and Pluck reacted by bludgeoning and suffocating the sisters to death. They then piled the sisters' living room furniture over the bodies of their victims and set everything on fire. Both men were jailed for life at Sheffield Crown Court in 1996. In February 2012, Pluck died in prison. Bierton, however, was released from prison on licence in 2017. He was recalled to prison in 2018 but released on licence once again in 2020. On the 9th of November 2021 in Worksop, Nottinghamshire, Bierton battered his 73-year-old neighbour, Pauline Quinn, to death with her own coffee table. The cause of death was traumatic head injuries. Bierton's abuse of drug and alcohol was considered by the prosecution to be a contributing factor to the man's acts. Bierton got his whole life order in 2023. Ryan Matthews committed 2 murders and got life for those murders in 1983. On getting out, he went and murdered a healthcare assistant called Sharon Wall at Wootton Hill Hospital in Gloucester. He did that on the 9th of July 2014. Matthews left Broadmoor Secure Hospital in 1999 under the Mental Health Act, and his mental health had deteriorated throughout stays in various hospitals following his release. Matthews, who used to be known as Stephen Cecil King, got his whole life order in 2015. Andrew Dawson, who was born in 1962, has killed all of 3 people in his lifetime, and he did so between 1981 and 2010. In August 1981, in his native Ormskirk up in Lancashire, Dawson murdered his first victim, Henry Walsh. Mr. Walsh was a shopkeeper who was 91 years old at the time of his murder, and Dawson stabbed the man 11 times. Dawson was convicted of Mr. Walsh's murder in 1982, but was released on licence in 1999. On the 25th of July 2010, John David Matthews was found stabbed to death in his flat in the Derby area of Chaddesden. 5 days later, in the same area, Paul Hancock was also fatally stabbed. And you'll never guess who stabbed them both. On both occasions, Dawson placed the bodies of his victims in a bathtub of their respective flat so that he could get rid of their odours. On the same day that Matthew's body had been found, Dawson was arrested in Whitehaven, which is in Cumbria. On the 18th of July 2011, he got his whole life order. Ian McLaughlin was born in 1958. Between 1970 and 1983, he was in and out of prison for a range of offences, including burglary and theft. In 1983, he beat his boyfriend, Lendell Gatty, over the head with a hammer and then strangled him with a towel. He was convicted of manslaughter and got 10 years, but that was reduced on appeal to 8 years, and then the man was released after only 5 years anyway. In September 1991, he got his new boyfriend, a barman called Peter Halls, to lie on the bed in a fantasy game and then killed him by stabbing him in the back. In 1992, he got life with a minimum of 25 years. In July 2012, he was let out of prison on day release, and he decided to use that day release to go around the home of ex-prisoner and SE ex-offender, 86-year-old Francis Corey Wright, who he'd met in prison, and rob him. And so that's what he did. He tied Corey Wright up while he searched his house, and he was just about to leave with a pillowcase full of family heirlooms when a neighbour by the name of Graham Buck came over to investigate the shouting that he'd heard. McLaughlin dragged Mr. Buck into the house and then killed him by stabbing him in the neck. In 2014, the 40-year minimum term that McLaughlin had got in 2013 for the murder of Mr. Buck was upgraded to a whole life order. Wilbert Anthony Dyce got away with the murders of a mother and her 2 children for nearly 3 decades. Dyce was 26 when he raped and stabbed Norma Richards, 27, to death after following her home from a nightclub on the 17th of July 1982. He then stabbed her 9-year-old daughter Samantha to death and drowned 7-year-old Siretta in the bath at their flat at 54 Kingsgate Estate, Dalston, East London. Dyce, whose own mother lived just a few hundred yards away, left the scene after daubing the NF for National Front symbol on the walls in an attempt to make the murder look like a racist murder. The bodies of all 3 victims were found 2 days later on July the 19th by their grandmother Myra and by the stepsister of the 2 girls, Rodine. The murder weapon may have been a 19th century bayonet, which was kept in the flat as an ornament. Nobody suspected Dyce's involvement, his name was never given to the police, and he was never interviewed. It was only during a review in 2009, which was sparked by a query from a journalist researching a book about the footballer Laurie Cunningham, the brother of Norma's partner, that his DNA was matched to semen samples that were found at the scene. Confronted with this damning evidence, Dyce claimed that he had had sex with Norma Richards in the toilet of a nearby club hours before her death. He was convicted, however, of all 3 murders on the 17th of December 2010 after a trial at the Old Bailey. The court heard that he had also sexually attacked 2 other women in their own homes and stabbed his ex-wife. At the age of 54, Dyce was jailed for life with a whole life order. For committing 3 murders plus grape, all in a single sitting, Arthur Hutchinson, who was born in Hartlepool, North East England in February 1941, has been locked up since 1983. When, on the 22nd of October 1983, he sighted in the garden of a home in Dore, South Yorkshire, a large marquee, Hutchinson was on the run. The marquee was where 59-year-old Basil Laintner, his 55-year-old wife Avril, their 28-year-old son Richard and their 18-year-old daughter Nicola had, earlier that day, held the wedding party of the couple's other daughter, Suzanne. After entering the marquee in search of food, Hutchinson broke into Richard's bedroom and stabbed him to death. When the perpetrator was confronted by Richard's father, Basil, at the top of the stairs, he stabbed him as well, the man ending up at the bottom of the stairs after falling backwards. Hutchinson then stabbed Richard's mother, Avril, in the downstairs bedroom before going back upstairs and raping Nicola at knife point, first in her room, then out in the marquee, and then once again back in her room. To get Nicola from her room to the marquee and back again, the perpetrator had walked her past the dead bodies of her mother, father and brother. After being caught on the 5th of November 1983, shockingly, the perpetrator was only sentenced at the conclusion of his trial that was held in September 1984 to 18 years. Thankfully, the Home Secretary of the time, Leon Britton, subsequently upgraded the sentence to a whole life term, and Hutchinson's many appeals against that tariff have all failed. In late August 1988, Anthony Arkwright who was born in 1967 and comes from Wath-upon-Dearn, South Yorkshire, murdered in the space of 56 hours at least 3 innocent individuals, one of which being none other than his own grandfather. One of 5 siblings, all of whom having had their mother walk out on them at an early age, Arkwright was subject for much of his life to rumours that his own existence had sprung from an act of sexual intercourse between his mother and her male progenitor. While he was inside in his late teens for offences of burglary and disorder and for other crimes, he read up on serial killers and told his fellow inmates that he would one day be as famous as Jack the Ripper. On getting out, Arkwright got a job at a scrap merchant's in Mexborough, South Yorkshire, only to be sacked on the 26th of August 1988 for forever bunking off. The young man responded to this event first by going round to his grandfather's house in Adwick Road, Mexborough, stabbing the man, 68-year-old Stanislav Podojkas, in the neck, and then taking hold of a 6-kilogram lump hammer and crushing the man's skull with it. Assuming that he only murdered his granddad because he thought the man was his dad as well, he killed the man for nothing. His granddad was nothing more to him, relationship-wise, than his granddad. It has never been proven that Arkwright murdered his granddad's 73-year-old housekeeper, Elsa Chronodite, while subsequently stealing the dead man's £3,000 savings. This allegation, however, sits on the perpetrator's criminal file as a matter of record. When, in the early hours of the 28th of August, Arkwright broke into the home of his next-door neighbour, 48-year-old former teacher Raymond Ford, who Arkwright had always hated and always victimised, and stabbed the man up to 540 times before draping his entrails around the room. But for the devil's mask that he had on, he was stark naked. In the morning of the 29th of August, to complete his maniacal murder spree, Arkwright broke into the specially adapted bungalow belonging to his other next-door neighbour, 25-year-old wheelchair user Marcus Law. As payback for all the cigarettes that Law had scrounged off him before that point, Arkwright stabbed the defenceless man at least 70 times before trying to gut him, exactly as he had done to poor Raymond. On failing to rip out the man's insides, Arkwright opted instead to embed one of his victim's crutches into a gaping wound in the man's stomach. Gouging the man's 2 eyes out and then pushing cigarettes into his eye sockets, ears and mouth is what else the psycho did. Having been locked up since 1989, Arkwright is set to die in prison in line with his whole life prison order. He forgot, you see, to get away with murder like his savage and mentally disturbed idol Jack the Ripper did. I hope every day of his life in prison has been hell and that it stays like that forever.
The evidence I have heard shows you to be a jealous man, soaked in self-pity, a man who holds women in utter contempt.
That's putting it mildly, Mr. Justice Benetton. This is the judge who sentenced Kyle Clifford for the 3 horrendous murders that he committed on the 9th of July 2024, his sentencing having come in March 2025. This triple killer is going to cost the taxpayer millions because he's paralysed. That means in prison he needs lots of extra care. He paralysed himself in a failed suicide attempt that he made just before he got arrested for the murder of his ex-girlfriend Louise Hunt, her mother Carol and another sister in the family, Hannah. He committed those murders in the home of his ex-girlfriend on the 9th of July 2024. In addition, he raped Louise and held her captive for 2 hours before murdering her, and the judge of his trial said it must have become obvious to Louise in the course of her captivity that Clifford had already killed her mother.
This is no occasion to subject the family and friends of your victims to any delay or suspense. I therefore make clear at once that for each of these 3 murders, the sentence will be one of life imprisonment with a whole life order. That means a sentence from which you will never be released.
And let me clarify that at the time of his sentencing, Clifford was in his 20s. John Duffy is a rapist and murderer whose close friendship with his partner in his evil crimes, David Mulcahy, stemmed from their shared Irish Catholic heritage. Born in 1958 in the Republic of Ireland, Duffy, whose family moved over to England in search of work, instantly hit it off with Mulcahy in the year 1970 at Haverstock School in Camden, North London. At 13, the two once played a game of cricket together at school, using a living hedgehog as a ball. Then one day, when, as young adults, Duffy was working as a carpenter while Mulcahy was working as a plumber, the two were gutted when the woman that they had, out of the blue, decided to burgle and grape, failed to return home on the night in question. The plan of the two men to burgle and grape another woman was again thwarted when the woman came home with a man. One night in October 1982, though, the two did grape a 21-year-old woman after jumping out on her as she walked home and then putting a knife to her throat before forcing her into the garden of an empty house. In the course of 1983, the two men, who, by this point, were both married, committed no fewer than 18 grapes, their victims being pounced on late at night in streets mainly near railway stations in Hampstead, Barnet and other areas around North London. This led to the two men gaining the media dubbing of the railway grapists. The two men continued their grapes through to 1985, committing on one occasion 3 grapes in a single night in the said year, Hendon being where. In December of the said year, the two men strangled 19-year-old Alison Day to death with her own blouse near Hackney Wick, East London. They did that after graping her. In April 1986, they did the same to 15-year-old Marta Tamboza, sorry if I mispronounced that name, in West Horsley in Surrey, southeast England. The following month, they kidnapped 29-year-old Anne Locke after she got off a train at Brookmans Park railway station in Hertfordshire and then raped her before murdering her. Duffy later offered a simple explanation for the two men's escalation to the offence of murder. Grape alone had stopped satisfying them. When, on the 26th of November 1986, Duffy was arrested while following a woman in a secluded park, the perpetrator having taken to committing grape alone on some occasions, you see, his 3 murders, along with some of his grapes, rapidly unravelled. What he kept secret for years, however, even after the 30-year prison term that he got in early 1988 was later upgraded to a whole life order, was the identity of his accomplice. Mulcahy, though, a father of 5, has been locked up since 2001 and isn't expected to get out even when he's done his 30-year minimum term, his former partner in grape and murder having grassed him up, you understand, in 1997. Steve Wright, who was born in 1958, is known in the media as the Suffolk Strangler, the man behind the Ipswich serial killings of late 2006. Between the 30th of October and the 10th of December 2006, the bodies of 5 women, who all happened to be sex workers, were discovered at different locations near Ipswich in Suffolk, England. While their bodies were discovered naked, there were no signs of SA. 2 of the victims, Annalie Alderton and Paula Clennell, were confirmed to have been killed by strangling. The cause of death of the other 3 victims, Gemma Adams, Tanya Nichol and Annette Nichols, was never established, the perpetrator himself staying silent on the matter. Similarly, the man has never said why he killed the 5 women. Was it due to resentment of and disgust for women who sell sex, like the case of Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper? Who knows? What is known, though, is that Wright himself was a long-standing user of sex workers. Wright got his whole life order in 2008. If this video has gripped you, I recommend you to watch this one next. I'll meet you there.